Let's talk about an idea that, honestly, shapes almost everything we do, whether we realize it or not. I'm talking about stuff like driving a car, owning a home, even just walking down the street. It's called the standard of care. Now, this isn't some strict rule book. Think of it more like a constant balancing act, one that we all perform every single day to try and keep each other safe. So, let's get right into it.
Okay, to make this real, let's just picture a simple scenario. You're in your favorite cozy bookstore. You see an old wooden stool tucked in an aisle, to help you reach that top shelf. But it's a little wobbly. Is that just a charming, rustic detail, or is that owner being kind of negligent? The answer to that question actually unpacks this huge, really powerful idea.
So, how do we decide? Well, the legal system gives us this tool, the standard of care. And the definition here is everything. It's not about being perfect, it's about what a reasonable person would do. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds super vague, right? But that's the point. That flexibility is what makes this whole concept work in our complicated world, because what's reasonable in one situation might be totally unreasonable in another.
So how in the world do we figure out what's reasonable? Well, courts came up with this really practical 4-part test. They ask these 4 pretty straightforward questions to figure out if someone met that standard. Let's use this exact framework to put our wobbly bookstore stool to the test.
Okay, first things first, we have to really understand the risk itself. What's the potential for things to go wrong here? So we're going to look at the first 2 questions in our test, which together help us measure the actual size and shape of the danger. This is one side of our balancing act.
Let's start with probability. How likely is it that someone is actually going to get hurt on that stool? I mean, if it's sitting in a super busy aisle right by the new bestsellers and people are using it 50 times a day, then yeah, the probability of an accident is pretty high. But what if it's tucked away in some dusty corner of the poetry section and it's barely been touched in years? Well, then the probability is way, way lower. Okay, next up, we have to think about the seriousness of that potential harm. If someone does fall, how bad could it really be? For a teenager, a fall from that stool might just be a little embarrassing, maybe a bruise. But for an elderly customer, that exact same fall could be a life-altering injury. So you see, the more serious the potential harm, the higher the standard of care gets.
But here's the thing. The law doesn't just look at risk in a vacuum. It's practical. It also looks at the other side of the scale. What's the cost, the effort, and even the social value of whatever is creating that risk in the first place?
So, back to our bookstore owner. What's the burden here? How hard is it really to fix the problem? If all it takes is tightening a few screws with a screwdriver, that's an incredibly low burden. It takes 2 minutes, costs nothing. But if the stool is just fundamentally broken and needs to be replaced with, say, a $1,000 industrial safety ladder, well, the burden is much, much higher. And that completely changes the calculation.
And finally, the 4th question, social utility. Basically, is this risky thing even useful? Well, that stool serves a very clear purpose, right? It helps customers reach books, which is kind of the whole point of a bookstore. It has high utility. This is totally different from, say, a purely decorative but super sharp statue sitting right in the middle of a busy aisle. That would have almost zero utility.
All right, we've got our 4 factors, 2 on each side of the issue. Now comes the moment of truth. This is where a reasonable person, or a court, does that mental balancing act, weighing all these things together to make a final judgment.
And here's where it all comes together visually. On one side of our scale, you've got the total risk. That's the likelihood of the fall, plus how severe it could be. On the other side, you have the practicality of prevention. How hard is it to fix, and how useful is the stool in the first place? The standard of care is all about which way this scale tips. If the risk is high and the fix is easy, a reasonable person takes action. But if the risk is tiny and the cost to prevent it is enormous, well, the balance shifts.
And this is why this whole thing matters to every single one of us. This is not just some dusty old legal concept for lawyers and judges. It's a mental model that we can, and actually, we already do, use every single day to navigate our world safely and responsibly.
So, what are the big takeaways here? First, and this is huge, remember the goal is just being reasonable, not perfect. Nobody expects you to prevent every single possible accident. Second, context is everything. What's reasonable is always changing. Third, you can literally use these 4 questions as a guide in your own life. And finally, it all comes down to that essential balance between keeping people safe and, living in a practical, functioning world.
And that leaves us with a final thought. Think about it. From checking your blind spot before you change lanes to putting a wet floor sign down after you mop, you are constantly making these kinds of calculations. So,
What does this balancing act look like in your life? How does this invisible framework help all of us get through the world just a little more safely, together?